On our street, whole families up and disappear. Stacey Perman heard her mother joke on the phone in the autumn of 1982, another glass of red wine in her hand. Stacey knew her mother didn't usually drink, not even at social gatherings, but her family were going through tough times, and the likes of which they'd never experienced before. Her mother's joke wasn't really a joke at all, but more like a way for everyone left in the tragic wake of this case to cope and try to ease the growing terror that was building inside them all. Lassen was a quiet suburban street in the Valley, California. Quaint, stable, quite affluent, the Salomon family at the end of the road fit right in. In 1971, Elaine Salomon had been a 28-year-old, recently divorced mother in a Hollywood bar when she met Saul. He was 24, a newly arrived Israeli immigrant who'd only been in the country a year when a striking blonde caught his eye across a crowded bar lounge. The two spoke. The evening clearly went well, and before long, Elaine was moving her daughter Michelle to Lassen in the Valley. By then, Elaine and Saul were married, and together they'd had a son named Mitchell. Saul had snatched up that American dream, and he'd also landed on his feet financially. His first year living in the United States had been spent driving taxis and selling encyclopedias to get by, but now he owned his own business, refilling fire extinguishers, and he'd made it big. Elaine could afford to stay at home and look after the children. The driveway was filled with flashy, expensive cars, and their home was always filled with the latest and greatest technology that the 80s had to offer. Life was good by the time Stacey and Michelle became friends. The two girls, both teenagers, spent hours in Michelle's bedroom, lying on her pink princess canopy bed, and talked about everything and nothing all at once. On paper, Stacey and Michelle didn't have that much in common. Stacey liked books and Michelle liked boys, but somehow the two girls became inseparable. Elaine, now volunteering at a local clinic, often took the pair of them to lunch in the Bon Adventure Hotel, and when they weren't hanging out in fashion malls or at the movies, the pair of them could be found in each other's bedrooms, listening to music and reading magazines. It was by some twist of fate that Stacey hadn't been with Michelle on Tuesday, October 12, 1982. She'd originally planned to spend the evening with Michelle, Elaine, and Elaine's mother, Margaret Milarovitz. But Stacey had also known that one thing would lead to another, and she'd be home late if she went out with them. It was a school night, and not really feeling up to a potentially long night, Stacey had cancelled. Which was why she didn't know where Michelle or any of the Salomons, for that matter, were when another neighbour called by Stacey's home the next day. The neighbour had a problem, and it wasn't one she thought she could fix on her own, either. She lived in a cul-de-sac right behind the Salomons, but she didn't actually know them, and she needed to contact them as soon as possible. Something with Salomon's pool had gone wrong, and it was overflowing, flooding their neighbour's garden in the process. The neighbour may not have known the Salomons, but she knew Stacey's mother, and she asked if she could speak with the Salomons on her behalf and get them out to sort the problem with their pool. Stacey's mother immediately agreed and picked up the phone. She first tried to call the Salomon household, but nobody answered. But that was no problem. Stacey and her mother then did the next most reasonable thing and headed over there themselves to talk with the Salomons in person. They walked up to the house, seeing both Saul's car and his work truck still parked outside, and they also saw the backyard flooded with water. Mish Mish, the family dog, was out back too, and barely seemed to notice when Stacey and her mother walked by. They tried all of the doors on the exterior of the property. They looked through the windows, but the house was quiet, and it looked like nobody was home. It was a weekday, so perhaps it wasn't too unusual, but Stacey's mother made one last call just to be sure. She called up Elaine's mother, Marge, to see if she knew where the Salomons were, but Marge hadn't heard from any of them since the night before, and she was starting to get worried. Elaine and Marge were incredibly close and talked on the phone several times a day, but Elaine hadn't called that day at all. In fact, Marge knew that Elaine had cut a phone call with a friend short the night before, saying that one of Saul's business associates was at the door, and since then it had been radio silent. Stacey's mother didn't need to hear anything else to know that something wasn't quite right, so she hung up the phone with Marge and called the police. They arrived on the scene within minutes, and just as one of the Salomons' neighbours, Marty Lafer, was pulling up to his own driveway after a day at work, Marty was a good man to know when there was an investigation underway. He was a former IRS investigator making the transition to become a forensic accountant, and when he saw that the police were about to turn around and leave after only trying the Salomons' door, Marty told them to take a closer look. He reminded them that the Salomons had 2 children, the then 14-year-old Michelle and the 9-year-old Mitchell, and he said when there were children involved, it was better to be safe than sorry. The investigators listened, and Marty showed them a way into the house through one of the windows. Stacey, her mother, and Marty all followed them inside, and Marty even called his wife, Doreen, from the phone in the master bedroom to tell her that everything looked just fine. The house was clean, everything was in its place, and even the beds were made. Doreen later said that it was hearing that last bit that made a chill run down her spine. Elaine never made the beds, she told Marty over the phone, and then urged him to keep looking. The Salomons were nowhere to be found, but it was when everyone looked into Michelle's room that they found a gruesome clue as to what happened to them. Michelle's bed had been broken, her bedsheets and pillowcases were gone, and there was blood spatter on her walls and mattress. Despite this evidence, the investigators opened a missing persons case and began searching for the Salomons. That was only one of a long list of complaints Marty Lafer would later have about the investigation. According to Marty, the police contaminated any physical evidence that could have potentially been at the scene that night. He caught them letting people in and out of the house and saw them raiding the Salomon pantry for food that they ate while still on the premises. Later statements from the authorities defended the police on the scene and said that they were not aware of any misconduct that Marty alleges occurred during the investigation. But there were places where Marty and the investigators saw eye to eye, and that was who they thought was responsible for the Salomon family's fate. The investigation was still classified as a missing persons case until about a week after the Salomons had gone missing, with that all changing with a chilling discovery on the side of the Antelope Valley Freeway. A worker stumbled upon some documents that belonged to Saul and Elaine, strewn and scattered along the side of the road, and another search was quickly launched. The team came back with 2 wallets, both belonging to Saul and Elaine, and they also came back with more documents with their names on them too. It was that discovery that changed the missing persons case into a murder investigation, and it was quickly followed by a moment that Stacey will never forget. She'd been home alone after school, still thinking that Michelle would knock on her door at any minute, when someone actually did. She opened it only to find the police on the other side, and they had a question to ask her. Stacey showed them inside, where they opened a bag and pulled out a bloodied bedsheet. They then asked Stacey if she had ever seen it on Michelle's bed, and suddenly it all hit her. Her best friend was dead. Stacey burst into tears, but she managed to get out that she didn't remember seeing those particular bedsheets in Michelle's room, which is probably not what the investigators wanted to hear, but it didn't change the fact that the police already had a suspect in mind. With his brown hairpiece, constant cigarette in his mouth, and a taste for the high life, the investigators couldn't quite figure out how Saul Salomon could afford to live the way he did, especially when his tax papers said that he earned only $15,000 a year. Sure, he owned his own business, but even with the profit from that, Saul seemed to be living well beyond his means. The investigators came up with a theory to explain how Saul could continue to support his family and his penchant for luxury cars with the money he had coming in, and that was that Saul was involved with the Israeli mafia. Caught up in the moment, stories about Saul dealing drugs, selling Uzis, and frequenting strippers and sex workers started coming out of the woodwork. But was any of it actually true? Through the course of the investigation, the police were able to connect Saul to one known criminal, and he turned out to be a name that cropped up again and again. Harvey Rader was a thug, a hard man from the underbelly of London. He had the rap sheet to go with the reputation. Fraud, armed robbery, and assault. Harvey had seen more than his fair share of the inside of a British prison cell, and now he was in America. But the change in scenery didn't mean a change in Harvey's MO, however. If anything, it only tipped the scales further. In 1980, Harvey was at his old tricks again, and this time he was going big. He was involved in the now infamous arson that razed Saudi Sheikh Mohammed Al Fasi's Sunset Boulevard mansion to the ground. It had all been a front. The conspirators would all claim their share of the insurance payout, but Harvey got something else as well. He was then involved in the fencing of the artwork from Mohammed's property, and he would get his share of that too. But as those who have already heard the story behind that case probably know, the scheme was thwarted. The culprits were caught, and somehow Harvey came out on top yet again. Harvey received immunity in return for his testimony in court, which was why he was out on the streets and able to meet the Salomons. According to Doreen Lafer, Saul and Harvey had a contemptuous relationship. The two had never really gotten along and even had gone years without speaking to each other, which was why Doreen was so surprised to hear Saul had recently invested $20,000 in Harvey's business. Harvey now owned and ran his own car dealership, but that's not where the connections between the Salomons and Harvey ended. In fact, it was more like the beginning. Harvey and Saul had been together that evening. According to Harvey's statement, the two of them had left Saul's house at around 6 p.m. to head to a car auction. Harvey had then dropped Saul off at an Israeli restaurant in town before heading off to Saul's house again. His second visit that night had multiple purposes. He was dropping off one of Saul's cars, but he was also picking up Elaine's to take back to the shop to do some work on it. That's why Elaine had told her friend over the phone that Harvey was at the door and abruptly hung up the night that the Salomon family went missing. That makes Harvey the last person to see both Saul and Elaine, but his connections to the case only grew stronger from here. Only days into the search, Doreen had stopped by the Salomon household to find Harvey inside, talking over the phone with Saul's brother. He was Kurt, had scratches on his hands that he later had said had come from working on the cars, and had allegedly asked Doreen if she knew where the guns were. Doreen didn't have an answer for him, but she did have a question. She asked him where the Salomons were, and Harvey had reportedly answered her that they'd probably gone on holiday. Doreen instantly did not believe him. Their clothes and suitcases were still at home, and in a later interview she said, "They wouldn't have gone on vacation without telling me." This sentiment was shared by her husband Marty, who said that, quote, "When Elaine goes to the bathroom, all her friends and relatives know." The police spoke to Harvey the same day that Doreen had. They also noticed the scratches on his hands, and they also found his alibi more than a little lackluster. Even without putting too much weight on the rather major inconsistencies in his statement, like his story changing from him getting the keys to her car from Elaine that night to him leaving the keys in the mailbox, the investigators just weren't buying Harvey's version of events. The auction Harvey claimed that he and Saul had gone to that night had ended at 5 when they had only left the house at 6. The restaurant he'd claimed to have dropped Saul off at later that night had been closed, and it looked like Harvey's lies were just catching up with him. Then the investigators were able to tie him to 3 other cases, all of them involving missing people as well. Just 7 months before the Salomons went missing, a British couple that Harvey sold cars to had also just upped and vanished. There are reports that say Harvey had informed the police that Peter Davis, the husband, was involved in the selling of stolen jewellery and guns, and the police had taken the accusations seriously. They rushed to the Davises' house only to find the pair of them gone. Their car was later found abandoned in the Los Angeles International Airport parking lot. That was 2 out of the 3 missing people that the investigators connected to Harvey, but what about the third? He actually went missing just 2 months before the Davises did. A businessman named Ron Adib told his family that he was going to see a man about buying new cars right before he disappeared. His car was also found abandoned in the same airport parking lot, and the man he'd gone to see had been Harvey Rader. The investigators believe that the Davises and Ron Adib had actually been murdered. Their cars had been abandoned at the airport to throw the investigators off the killer's scent, but now they believed they had him. According to the investigators, Marty and Doreen Lafer and Elaine's mother, Marge, Harvey Rader had murdered the Salomon family. The only thing they had to do was prove that he had, and within a year of the investigation, they believed they had the way to do just that. But to say that it had been the investigators that had found the lead would be a stretch of the truth. It was a private investigator hired by Marge in a desperate attempt to find her missing family that recovered the lead, but it was a lead that would blow the case wide open. His name was Ashley Paul, Harvey's cousin and his alleged right-hand man. Ashley had worked for the Davises. He'd even admitted that he'd driven Paul Davis home from a car auction the very same night that he went missing. But the investigators hadn't connected him to the Salomon case, and Ashley had seized his chance. He'd fled back to England, where he was working as a taxi driver when Joe Sampson, Marge's PI, found him. Ashley refused to talk, claiming that he was too afraid of his cousin to say anything, but Joe eventually got him to come around. It involved a ruse fit for any crime thriller and undercover mystery, but it was one that worked. Joe had a woman approach Ashley, claiming to be one of Elaine's relatives, and that she was there to warn him that a group of Israelis were out to get him to avenge the Salomons, and Ashley caved. When Joe spoke to him again, Ashley said that he would tell him and the LAPD everything if they would grant him immunity. Lead investigator on the case, Larry Bird, said, "Obviously he was scared to death that Harvey would find out what he was doing." And he was right, too. It took coming back to California for Ashley to cop up to everything that had happened, but once he opened the floodgates, everything and the kitchen sink came out. According to Ashley, Saul had been at Harvey's dealership that night, asking for his $20,000 back. Harvey had promptly responded by pulling out a gun and shooting Saul in the head. Harvey and Ashley then bundled Saul's body into the back of Saul's car, but they still had a problem. Elaine had known that Saul was out with them that night, and if Saul didn't come home, she would lead the police right to them. Harvey and Ashley had then gone to the Salomon household, where Elaine had hung up the phone and opened the door for them, only for Harvey to smash her head in the marble countertop of the bar. 9-year-old Mitch he'd beaten with a baseball bat, and then he'd strangled 14-year-old Michelle to death. From there, Harvey and Ashley had put all the bodies into the trunk and driven off. Harvey had then gone back to the crime scene later that night to clean up and cover their tracks. Ashley led the police to where he remembered helping Harvey bury the bodies out in the desert, but later searches came back with nothing. "He was lying," Bird later said, or he didn't really want us to find the bodies because he thought if we'd never find them, nobody could be prosecuted. Later he went on to say, "If I remember, Harvey told somebody he knew about mine shafts being a great place to bury bodies, but Ashley never took us to mine shafts. He only took us to areas where he thought there would be shallow graves." But whether they liked it or not, Ashley was their only witness, and he was the only way the prosecution could definitively prove that Harvey had killed the Salomons. And the prosecution fumbled. Harvey was arrested within days of Ashley arriving in the States, and within days of Harvey's arrest, Ashley's testimony was struck from the record. The municipal court judge deemed that Ashley had been coerced. He hadn't understood his rights, his immunity deal was invalid, and his testimony could therefore not be used in court. Ashley took his chance and got on the next plane out. The case against Harvey crumbled, and the only thing the authorities could do was deport him for failing to make his previous convictions in the UK known during his immigration application. While investigators were ripping up the car park of Harvey's dealership to look for bodies, Harvey slipped back into America with a fake passport. The search of the car park came back empty-handed, but they were able to convict Harvey for passport fraud, which landed him with a 3-year sentence in federal prison. They had Harvey behind bars for now, but what they still didn't have was any evidence to tie him to the disappearances of the Salomon family. In another twist, when Harvey was nearing the end of his sentence, the LAPD took Harvey to court, claiming that they had new evidence that proved that he had actually killed the Salomons, not just made them disappear. Harvey went to court, facing the death penalty if he were found guilty, but his defense lawyer, Mark Lessam, had a few things to say that tipped the scales in a different direction. His own team of private investigators had checked Harvey's office in the dealership for blood, and it had come back completely clean, but he also pointed out that Harvey was by far not the only suspect in this case. He alluded to Saul's connections to the Israeli mafia, and Marge also made a startling confession. Life in the Salomon household really hadn't been as picture-perfect as it had seemed. Saul had in fact been frequenting strippers and sex workers, and Elaine had been having an affair. In fact, Elaine had been so close to ending things with Saul that it had only been a timely intervention from Marge that had saved their marriage. "I told her to stay," Marge said in a later interview. "You have a beautiful home, you don't have to work, you go out with your friends and have whatever you want. Stay with Saul." These new revelations and the fact that the prosecution kept arguing that Harvey's entire motive had been robbery, even though thousands of dollars in jewellery had been found at the scene, were enough to send the jury into deadlock. It was stuck 11-1 for 3 weeks in favour of finding Harvey guilty of the murders, but the 12th jury member wouldn't budge, and the reason she'd stayed steadfast was quite a big one. In her opinion, the prosecution hadn't done enough to actually prove that the Salomons were dead, and it was that opinion that led the defence when Harvey's case inevitably went to court again. This time around, a pharmacist, petrol station attendant, and a police dispatcher all claimed to have seen the Salomons since their disappearance, and a fresh jury deliberated the evidence for just 2 days. Finally, the judge read the verdict of not guilty, which made Harvey faint in the middle of the courtroom. When later asked if they believed that Harvey was actually guilty, Marty Lafer said, "If somebody confessed to these killings other than Harvey Rader, I would never believe him. All of the evidence pointed to Rader." He also claimed that the police had botched the investigation by firstly contaminating the scene and missing crucial evidence like blood spatter that he and Doreen had later found under the beds. Larry Bird said, "It's pretty ironic that we have 7 dead people, and with all 7 dead people, Harvey was the last one to have anything to do with them." Marge said, "I hate Saul, I blame him," but she also broke down crying when Harvey was found not guilty and started screaming in the courtroom, "He is a killer. What kind of system justice is this? Where is the justice in the world?" About his client, Harvey's defense lawyer from his first trial said, "Look, Harvey's no angel, but he wouldn't harm a child." Whether he's guilty or not, Harvey seemingly has disappeared into the ether. The LAPD now have the stance that the wallets and documents found on the side of the freeway were intentionally placed there to distract the investigation, and that it's more than likely the Salomons are hidden somewhere in the abandoned mine shafts that litter the surrounding deserts of LA.